Hello everyone, I know you're here to use this video to help you sleep better, and I'm here to help you do just that. Just relax and unwind. Before we begin, could you leave a comment and let me know where you're from? What time is it where you are? How was your day? Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel to hear more stories. Now, let's get started. That morning, I headed out early, hoping to enjoy some quiet time by the lake. Fishing alone had always been my way to relax, especially after a stressful week. The weather was perfect, with a light mist hovering over the water and a refreshing chill in the air. I set up my gear and cast my line, savoring the surrounding tranquility. After a while, I noticed another fisherman not too far away. He waved and smiled, and I returned the gesture politely. He approached, rod slung over his shoulder, cheerfully calling out, "Good morning." I replied, trying to focus on my line. "You've got a nice spot here," he said, sitting down nearby. "Do you mind if I join you?" "Sure," I said, though I had preferred to be alone. He introduced himself as Mark and began chatting about fishing, the weather, and other small talk. I responded courteously but kept my answers brief. He seemed friendly enough, but I truly just wanted some peace. As time passed, Mark's friendliness started to feel invasive. He continuously asked about my life, where I lived, and what I did for a living. I provided vague answers, hoping he would take the hint. "How about over there?" he suggested, pointing to a quieter area of the lake. "No, I'm fine here," I said, not wanting to move. "Come on, I hear that spot is fantastic," he insisted. "Thanks, but I think I'll stay," I replied firmly. His friendly demeanor shifted slightly. "Suit yourself?" he mumbled. Moving closer to me, I began to feel uneasy. Something was off about him. His questions grew more personal, more intrusive. "Do you always come out here alone?" he asked, his tone overly curious. "Usually," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. He stared at me for a moment, then smiled again, but this time his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Beautiful, isn't it? Just a person in nature." "Yeah," I said, glancing at my phone. I decided it was time to leave. "I think I'll head back," I said, starting to pack up my things. "It's far from the best fishing time yet," he remarked, standing up. "I have things to do," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. He stepped closer, blocking my path. "Stay a little longer. It's not often you get good company here." Panic set in. "Really, I need to go," I insisted, my heart racing. He grabbed my arm. "Stay," he said, his grip tightening. I pulled my arm away. "Let go of me," I snapped, stepping back. His friendly facade completely dropped. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice low and threatening. I looked around, searching for an escape. My car was quite a distance away, and I wasn't sure I could outrun him. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation going while formulating a plan. He shrugged. "It's more fun with company," he said, stepping closer. I backed away, my mind racing. I remembered the knife in my tackle box. "Hey, I don't want any trouble," I said, moving toward my gear. "It's too late for that," he said, lunging at me. I grabbed a knife and swung it in front of me. He stopped, eyes wide. "Back off," I warned, holding the knife between us. He scoffed. "You think that scares me?" "Back off," I repeated, my voice trembling. He lunged again and I slashed at his arm. He screamed in pain but didn't stop. He charged at me, knocking the knife from my hand. We struggled on the ground, and I managed to kick him off me. I jumped up and ran toward my car, adrenaline propelling me forward. I could hear him behind me, yelling and cursing. I didn't look back, focusing solely on reaching my car. I arrived, rummaging for my keys with shaking hands. I unlocked the door and jumped inside, locking it behind me. He pounded on the window, but I started the engine and sped away, my heart racing. I drove straight to the nearest town and headed to the police station. At the station, they took my statement and dispatched officers to the lake, but by the time they arrived, Mark had vanished. I sat alone in my cabin, trying to unwind after a long day of working on cars. The night was still, with only the sound of crickets chirping outside. But then I heard it, a distant rumble of an engine cutting through the quiet. My heart skipped a beat. Who would come here at this hour? I peered through the window, and there it was, a car slowly crawling down my driveway. My pulse quickened as I watched several figures step out. They were wearing masks, distorted, eerie masks that made my skin crawl. I didn't recognize any of them. A wave of dread washed over me. Something was very wrong. I rushed to the door and locked it, my hands trembling. Outside, I could hear them murmuring in low voices, voices too calm for what I felt inside. Panic clawed its way up my spine. I grabbed my phone, but of course, no signal. I was completely on my own. Suddenly, they began banging on the door, their voices turning harsh, demanding to be let in. My heart pounded, each thud louder than the last, and sweat beaded on my forehead. They were planning to break in. I could feel it in their tone. I couldn't just sit and wait. In desperation, I remembered the tools in my garage. Heavy, solid tools. I grabbed a wrench and held onto it tightly, like it was the only thing standing between me and death. My breath came in quick gasps as I stood by the door, waiting, the sound of my heartbeat deafening in my ears. When they finally broke through, everything exploded into chaos. I swung the wrench with all the force I could muster, adrenaline surging through me as if my life depended on it, because it did. I hit one of them hard, sending him crashing to the floor, but the others kept coming, relentless like predators closing in on prey. Fists flew, shouts echoed through the cabin, and I fought with a fear-driven fury I didn't know I had. Each swing of the wrench was wild and desperate, fueled by the terror surging through my veins. I could feel bruises forming, sharp pains stabbing through my body, but I didn't stop, couldn't stop. Then, in the blur of violence, I saw my chance. I bolted for the door, legs moving faster than I ever thought possible. Behind me, I could hear them yelling, but I didn't look back. I sprinted into the woods, weaving between the trees, heart hammering in my chest, lungs burning as I ran for my life. The darkness swallowed me, and I ran until my legs nearly gave out. When I finally reached the main road, I collapsed, gasping for breath, every inch of me trembling. The cabin was far behind, but the terror of that night would haunt me forever. I survived, but I'll never forget the feeling of being hunted in my own home. It started in the quiet of my suburban house when I noticed something strange. All the clocks had stopped, frozen at exactly 3:33 a.m. At first, I brushed it off as a weird coincidence. I fiddled with them, trying to fix the issue, but no matter what I did, the hands wouldn't move. It was like time itself had been frozen. That's when a cold shiver ran down my spine. Something wasn't right. Then I heard it, the whispers. Faint at first, like a soft breeze drifting through the halls, but they grew louder, more sinister with every passing second. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew. Something evil had taken root in my house. I could feel eyes on me, watching from the shadows, creeping closer. My instinct was to run, to flee and never look back, but my body wouldn't move. Fear had locked me in place. I reached for my phone, but it was dead. The realization hit me. I was trapped. Desperate, I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and started searching the house. The whispers seemed to follow me, echoing through the walls, twisting around me like a cold embrace. But no matter where I looked, there was no one there. It was as if I had stepped into some twisted reality where I was utterly alone, yet watched by something unseen. I wanted to scream, to escape, but I couldn't. The whispers wouldn't stop. They circled me, mocking, reminding me of the darkness lurking inside my home. My breath quickened, my chest tightened. I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of it all. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the whispers suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, but it felt like a massive weight had been lifted. Without thinking, I bolted. I ran out of the house, not stopping until I was far, far away. I didn't care where I ended up, as long as it was away from the whispers, from that evil. But even as I stood panting in the middle of the street, I knew it wasn't over. Something had been in my house, and it was still waiting. In the second part, the camping story, I was leading a group of tourists on a camping trip, deep in the middle of nowhere. The forest surrounded us, thick with towering trees and the sounds of nature. It seemed like just another ordinary day in the woods, until we stumbled upon something strange. Hidden among the trees was a stone circle, ancient and ominous. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie. I should have known better than to mess with something like that. But curiosity got the best of me, and I started poking around, trying to make sense of it. That's when the air around us changed. It felt heavy, oppressive, like we weren't alone anymore. One of the tourists let out a blood-curdling scream, and I spun around to see it. something monstrous and twisted emerging from the shadows of the trees. Panic erupted. The tourists scattered, screaming, running in every direction. I wanted to run too, but I couldn't leave them behind. I yelled for them to stick together, to follow me back to camp. But that thing, it was right on our heels, stalking us, toying with us like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. We barely made it back to camp, but it wasn't over. The creature circled us, crawling and snarling like a wild animal. I was trying to keep everyone calm, but inside, I was panicking. I didn't know how to protect them, or myself, from this thing. It seemed unstoppable. Then I remembered something I'd read in a survival guide. It said that sometimes the best defense is a good offense. With no other choice, I grabbed the biggest stick I could find and charged at the creature, screaming like a madman. To my shock, it worked. The creature hesitated, as if surprised by my sudden attack. In that brief moment, I swung with everything I had, striking it square in the face. It let out an ear-splitting screech before vanishing into thin air. I couldn't believe it. We'd actually survived. We wasted no time packing up and getting out of there, running as fast as we could until we were miles away from that cursed stone circle. I don't know what that thing was, but I'm never going back into those woods again. Not if I can help it. Maybe my road trip didn't turn out as expected, but in the end, I wouldn't change a thing. Sometimes, you have to confront the darkness head-on, no matter how terrifying it might be. It was a typical night shift for me, cruising the city streets in my taxi, picking up fares and dropping them off. Just another night, or so I thought. The call came in around midnight, a request for a pickup at a dimly lit street corner on the outskirts of town. At first, it seemed routine. Late-night pickups were part of the job. As I pulled up to the location, I spotted a figure standing on the sidewalk, their face obscured by the shadows. They moved toward the taxi and climbed into the back seat without a word, their movements slow and deliberate. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but all I could make out was a silhouette, barely discernible in the darkness. Something about their presence made my skin crawl, but I tried to shake it off. "Where to?" I asked, doing my best to keep my voice steady despite the growing unease. For a few moments, silence filled the car, thick and suffocating. Then, in a low, chilling voice, the passenger finally spoke, directing me to a remote location far outside the city. My heart skipped a beat. Every horror story I'd ever heard about taxi drivers flashed through my mind. But I told myself to stay calm. I had a job to do, and the sooner I finished, the sooner I could get out of there. As we drove deeper into the countryside, the city lights disappeared behind us. The road ahead was deserted, illuminated only by the pale glow of the moon. I kept stealing glances at the passenger in the mirror, but their face remained hidden, swallowed by the darkness. A cold sweat began to form on my brow. Suddenly, the passenger spoke again, their voice colder and more menacing than before. "Pull over," they said, claiming they needed to make a quick stop. My hands tightened around the steering wheel as my heart pounded in my chest. Reluctantly, I complied, pulling the car to a stop on the side of a deserted road. I watched in growing dread as the passenger exited the car and disappeared into the night. Minutes ticked by, but they didn't return. Panic clawed at my throat. Alone, on an empty road, in the dead of night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Just as I was about to abandon the taxi and make a run for it, I heard footsteps approaching. My heart leapt into my throat. I froze, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. But when I turned, it wasn't the passenger I saw. It was a figure in a police uniform. Relief washed over me as I rolled down the window, explaining the bizarre situation. The officer listened, his face grim, not saying much. After a moment, he instructed me to follow him back to the station, where he promised they'd look into the matter. As we drove back toward the city, I couldn't shake the lingering sense of dread. What had that passenger been planning, and why had they left so suddenly? The terror of that night still haunts me. Maybe I'll never know the answers, but one thing's for sure. I'll never forget the icy grip of fear that wrapped around me in those dark, lonely hours. All right, let me set the scene. I'm a retired detective, just trying to enjoy my golden years with a road trip across the Midwest, visiting some old friends. Sounds peaceful, right? Well, I couldn't have been more wrong. I was cruising along these quiet country roads, soaking in the scenery, when I stumbled upon this tiny town that immediately gave me the creeps. It wasn't anything obvious, just something in the air that felt wrong. The place was too quiet, too still. But you know how it goes. Curiosity got the best of me, so I decided to pull over and check it out. What could possibly go wrong? The second I stepped out of my car, I felt it. Eyes watching me from the shadows. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Still, I tried to strike up a conversation with some of the locals, but they shut down fast, clamming up like they'd seen a ghost. Suspicious? You bet. I've got a nose for trouble, and this town reeked of it. So, I start digging, asking questions, poking around. What I uncovered made my blood run cold. This place wasn't just weird, it was rotten to the core. Turns out, the whole town was neck-deep in corruption and murder, and everyone was in on it. The further I dug, the more I realized this wasn't just some small-town gossip. I had stumbled onto something big, something deadly. And that's when things went sideways. I wasn't just an unwelcome guest anymore, I was a threat. The locals weren't subtle about it either. I started getting followed, cars lurking in my rearview mirror, shadowy figures hanging around my motel at night. Threats, too. Real ones. These people would stop at nothing to keep their skeletons locked away. But I'm no stranger to danger. I've been in worse scrapes, and I wasn't about to let these creeps get the best of me. I used every trick in the book, every bit of my old detective skills, just to stay one step ahead. But let me tell you, these guys were ruthless. No loose ends, no witnesses, no mercy. The deeper I went, the darker it got. Every new piece of evidence painted a horrifying picture. The murders, brutal. The corruption, staggering. And the worst part? I was completely alone. No backup, no reinforcements. Just me against an entire town, bent on silencing the truth. But I wasn't backing down. Not after a lifetime of fighting for justice. So I kept pushing, gathering enough dirt to bring this whole rotten operation crashing down. It wasn't easy. Every step forward felt like it might be my last, but I wasn't about to let them win. And finally, I cracked the case wide open. I exposed their crimes, dragged their secrets into the light, and brought the murderers to justice. When the dust settled, I looked around at the families of the victims, the ones who had waited so long for answers. And in that moment, I knew. I had made a difference. That felt damn good. I'm a musician, been on tour for a while now, and everything was going pretty smoothly, until my tour bus decided to break down in the middle of nowhere. And when I say nowhere, I mean some forgotten town in Texas that I've never even heard of. So, here I am, stranded in this desolate place with no clue how to fix the bus or when help might show up. I figure, why not make the most of it? Maybe explore the town while I wait. Big mistake. The moment I start wandering around, the place gives me the creeps. The streets are empty, and the buildings look like they've been abandoned for years, like something straight out of a zombie movie. And the few people I do see, they're staring at me with these blank, hollow eyes, like they're studying me, sizing me up. I try to brush it off, but that feeling of being watched clings to me like a shadow. I keep walking, trying to shake off the unease, when I come across this old, abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. It's massive, broken windows, graffiti all over the place. It practically begs me to check it out, so I do. I wish I hadn't. The second I step inside, the air feels different. Heavy. The place is pitch black, and the further I go, the stranger the noises get. Echoes, whispers, things that don't belong. I turn to leave, but before I can take a step, I feel something cold grab me from behind. My heart races. I fight, kicking, clawing, trying to break free. But whatever it is, whatever they are, it's too strong. I'm being dragged deeper into the darkness. The sounds get louder, more distorted. I can barely breathe. I try to scream, but the noise is swallowed up by the oppressive silence around me. Then, just as I think it's over, I see a faint glimmer of light ahead. With every ounce of strength left in me, I break free, stumbling toward the light. I collapse onto the cold, hard ground outside, gasping for breath, drenched in sweat. My whole body is shaking, and I have no idea how long I was trapped in there or what had me. But I know one thing. I need to get out of this town. Now. I scramble to my feet and run like my life depends on it, back to the main street, the only place that feels even remotely safe. But even then, I can't shake the feeling that something is still watching me, lurking in the shadows. I manage to flag down a passing car and hitch a ride, not caring where they're going as long as it's away from this cursed place. When the mechanic finally shows up, I don't waste a second. We fix the bus, and I put as much distance between me and that town as I can. I may never know what really happened there, what grabbed me in that factory, but one thing's for sure, I'll never forget the terror that wrapped itself around me in that forsaken place, and I swear I'll never set foot in that town again. I had ventured deep into the heart of the Australian outback, craving adventure and the thrill of the unknown. The vast, unforgiving desert stretched endlessly before me, and I relished the challenge of navigating its wild, untamed terrain. But as I pushed deeper into the wilderness, disaster struck. My car sputtered, coughed, and died, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. Panic gripped me as the reality of my isolation hit hard. The outback is no place to be stranded, and miles of desolation surrounded me in every direction. With no time to waste, I set out on foot, desperately hoping to stumble upon some sign of civilization, anything that could save me. But as I trudged under the relentless sun, the heat bore down on me, draining my energy and intensifying my thirst. The more I walked, the heavier my legs became, and the farther hope seemed to drift. Then, just as I was on the verge of collapse, I spotted figures on the horizon. Relief surged through me as I staggered toward them, convinced I'd found salvation. But as I drew closer, dread took its place. Those figures weren't human. It was a pack of dingoes, wild and feral, their eyes locked on me with predatory hunger. Fear shot through me like a lightning bolt. I was no longer just a traveler lost in the outback. I was prey. Alone, defenseless, and miles from help, I had no choice but to run. The snarls of the dingoes echoed behind me, growing louder as they gave chase. My heart pounded in my chest, the sun beating down like a furnace, but I pushed myself forward, sprinting through the desert, the sound of their snapping jaws too close for comfort. No matter how fast I ran, they were closing in. Their hot breath was on my heels and my legs were on fire, muscles screaming for me to stop, but I knew I couldn't afford to slow down. If I did, it would be the end. Just when it seemed like all hope was lost, I spotted a rocky outcrop in the distance. It was my only chance. With what little strength I had left, I sprinted toward it, every step a battle against exhaustion. The rocks loomed closer, and I pushed myself harder, lungs burning as I finally reached the shelter. I collapsed onto the hard ground, gasping for breath, praying the dingoes had lost my scent. For a long moment, I lay there, trembling in the shadow of the rocks, listening for any sign of the pack. But all I heard was the eerie silence of the desert night as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into darkness. I knew I couldn't let my guard down, not for a second. I huddled in the shadows, too terrified to close my eyes, every rustle of the wind a potential threat. The night was endless, filled with unseen dangers, lurking just beyond the edges of the rocks. But somehow, as dawn broke, I was still alive. I emerged from my hiding place, weak, shaken, but breathing. The dingoes were gone, but the fear remained. I had narrowly escaped death in the outback, but its savage grip still lingered. I woke to the harsh flickering of lights in my apartment, a stuttering glow that danced erratically across the room. At first, I thought it was just a power surge, but as I blinked away the haze of sleep and sat up, a gnawing sense of dread crept over me. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The uneasy quiet of the apartment pressed in around me as I slid out of bed, my heart beginning to pound with each step. The hallway ahead was drenched in shadow, interrupted only by the sporadic flashing of the lights. As I cautiously peered into the darkness, I saw it, a figure just beyond the reach of the dim, failing bulbs. Its form was obscured, its features indiscernible, but the way it stood still, watching, sent ice down my spine. My blood ran cold. I was not alone. I froze, caught between the instinct to confront the intruder and the terror that kept me rooted in place. Every muscle in my body tensed as I stared at the figure, unsure if it had noticed me. Then, without warning, it turned and melted into the darkness, vanishing as if it had never been there. My breath hitched, and the oppressive silence returned, thicker than before. With shaking hands, I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 as my voice trembled, trying to convey the panic I felt to the operator. But even as I explained the situation, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the figure was still there, somewhere, waiting for the right moment. Each minute felt like an eternity as I paced back and forth, my eyes darting to every corner, every shadow, listening intently for the slightest sound. My breath quickened, and then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate, they echoed through the hallway, growing louder with each step, closer with each breath. My heart thundered in my chest as I realized the figure was coming back. But this time they weren't alone. Backing away from the door, I scanned the room for an escape, but there was none. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were right outside. My pulse roared in my ears as the lights flickered again, casting the hallway into pitch-black darkness. I braced myself, body trembling with fear, ready for whatever horror awaited me on the other side of that door. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours as the oppressive dark pressed in around me. And yet, nothing came. No sound. No movement. Just silence. I exhaled shakily, my breath ragged as I realized the footsteps had stopped. The figure, gone, vanished into the night like a ghost. I sank to the floor, the tension in my body slowly unraveling, but my heart still raced wildly. The terror of that night clung to me like a shadow, a creeping fear that I couldn't quite shake. The figure, the footsteps, they were real. And even though they had disappeared, the memory of them, the fear that gripped me, would never leave. I parked my car in the basement of an underground garage, just after 11 p.m. It was one of those massive concrete structures where sound seemed to be swallowed up. My footsteps echoed against the walls as I made my way to the elevator. The place was almost empty, with only a few scattered cars, and most of the lights were either flickering or completely out. The air smelled stale, like old exhaust and rainwater, which always gave me a chill. But this was Seattle, and finding street parking at such a late hour was impossible, so I had no other choice. I had been out for dinner with a few friends, nothing too extravagant. When I returned to the garage, it was even quieter than before, as if the entire place was holding its breath. I stepped out of the elevator on the lower floor where I had parked. The sound of my heels echoed loudly against the concrete, too loud for the silence. I looked around, expecting to see my car in its spot, but it wasn't there. I stood there for a moment, confused. Maybe I had the wrong floor. That had to be it. I walked down the rows, checking the other side as well, but my car was nowhere to be found. My heart started beating a little faster. It was a silly mistake, but I was sure I had parked here. I was tired. Maybe I'd just confused myself. I went back to the elevator and tried another floor, but still, no car. The anxiety in my gut began to grow. I knew I wasn't wrong. I could clearly picture where I had parked, right by the flickering light near the far wall, but the spot was empty. I pulled out my phone to call someone, but the signal was weak down here. The bars kept flickering, coming and going. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it must be a mix-up, or maybe the car had been towed by mistake. I started walking around the garage, checking row after row, but it was all empty, just shadows and cold concrete. As I walked, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. In one of the darker corners, just beyond a broken light, I saw something move. Not much, just a faint shift in the shadows, like someone was standing there, watching me. I froze, squinting into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything clearly. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see something or someone step out of the shadows, but the corner remained still. I quickened my pace, the sound of my heels clicking faster on the concrete. I just wanted to find my car and get out of there. I reached the end of the garage and turned back, thinking maybe I'd missed something. That's when I saw him, a man standing a few rows away, just barely illuminated by one of the dim lights. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, and staring directly at me. My heart nearly stopped. I couldn't make out his face, but there was something about the way he stood so still that made my blood run cold. For a moment, I thought about calling out to him, asking if he had seen anything, but something inside me told me not to. Instead, I turned around and walked quickly in the opposite direction, hoping he would leave me alone. I didn't hear footsteps, but I could feel his eyes on me, drilling into the back of my neck. I kept walking, trying to stay calm, but my mind was racing. I needed to find my car to get to safety. I checked each row, each corner, but the garage felt like a maze, and I was getting more and more lost. The man was no longer in sight, but that only made things worse. I knew he was still somewhere in the darkness, watching. My breath started coming faster, and I felt the panic rising in my chest. I tried to come up with a plan, something to get out of this. I decided to head for the exit, thinking maybe I could find a security guard or someone who could help. But as I neared the exit, I saw the same man standing by the door, waiting. He was closer now, and I could see his face. It was blank, almost expressionless, but there was something cold in his eyes that sent chills down my spine. I stopped, unsure of what to do. He didn't move, just stood there, blocking the exit. I turned and hurried back into the garage, not caring about the noise my heels were making anymore. The only thought in my head was to get away from him. But the deeper I went, the more lost I felt. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness growing thicker. My car was nowhere to be seen, and I knew I was running out of time. I heard footsteps behind me, at first light, then louder. He was following me. I broke into a run, not caring if he heard me, my heels slamming against the concrete as I sprinted past rows of cars, my breath coming in gasps. I didn't dare look back, too scared of what I might see. I rounded a corner, trying to put as much distance between us as I could, but the footsteps were getting closer. My chest tightened, panic gripping me. I knew I couldn't run forever. I had to find a way out, somewhere to hide, anything. Suddenly, I spotted a maintenance door, slightly ajar at the end of a row. I bolted for it, pulling the door open and slipping inside just as the footsteps rounded the corner behind me. I gently closed the door, pressing my back against it and holding my breath. I was in a small, dark room filled with tools and cleaning supplies, the air thick with the smell of chemicals. I listened, straining to hear anything outside, but all I could hear was the pounding of my heart in my ears. I stood there, motionless, for what felt like hours, every sound making me jump, every creak of the building, convincing me he was right outside. I didn't know if he had seen me, if he was waiting for me to come out, or if he had already left, but I couldn't stay there forever. Slowly, I cracked the door open, just a sliver, peeking out into the garage. It was empty, the rows of cars stretching out in eerie silence. I didn't see him, but that didn't make me feel any safer. I slipped out of the room, staying low, and started making my way toward the nearest exit. My car was gone. I knew that now. Maybe it had been stolen, towed, or maybe something else entirely. I couldn't worry about that anymore. I just needed to get out. As I neared the exit, I scanned the area, my heart pounding in my throat. I didn't see him, and the doors were in sight, just a few more steps. I forced myself to keep moving, even though every instinct screamed at me to run. Just as I reached the door, I heard a sound behind me, the slow scrape of a shoe on concrete. I didn't dare turn around, couldn't. I pushed the door open and stepped into the stairwell, nearly leaping down the steps 2 at a time. I could hear him right behind me, his footsteps echoing in the stairwell. I burst out onto the street, the cool night air hitting me like a shock. I didn't stop running until I was several blocks away, among the lights and sounds of the city. Only then did I dare to look back, but the street was empty, no sign of him anywhere. I hailed a taxi and climbed in, my hands shaking as the car pulled away. I couldn't help but glance back at the garage, half expecting to see him standing at the entrance, watching me go, but there was nothing. I had rented a cabin in Vermont for the weekend, hoping to find some peace and quiet, far away from everything. The cabin was deep in the woods, completely isolated. When I arrived, it looked just like the pictures, small but cozy, with a big fireplace and large windows that let in plenty of light. It was supposed to be the perfect escape. The first day was beautiful. I settled in, made myself a cup of coffee, and read by the fire. The only sounds were the crackling flames and the wind outside. It felt like I was the only person in the world. That night, I went to bed early. The bed was comfortable, the cabin was warm, but I couldn't fall asleep right away. I kept hearing noises outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe some animals moving through the woods, since the forest was full of life. but the noises were strange, slow, deliberate, like footsteps. I tried to convince myself it was just a deer or something similar, but it was hard to ignore. Eventually, I drifted off after persuading myself that I was being foolish. The next morning, I felt a bit embarrassed about how worried I'd been. I made breakfast and decided to take a walk around the property to clear my head. The air was fresh, and everything was so still, as if the world had gone silent. But as I walked, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Muddy footprints leading up to the cabin. They weren't mine. I hadn't been outside in the mud since I arrived, and these prints were fresh. They led straight up to the back door and stopped there. I stared at them for a while, my mind racing to figure out where they had come from. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been outside the cabin last night, right near the door. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I hurried back inside and locked the door behind me. I tried to stay calm, telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe a hiker had gotten lost, though I hadn't seen anyone since arriving. I decided not to let it ruin my day. I tried to relax, but every little noise outside put me on edge. That night, the noises started again, the same slow, steady sound of footsteps. I listened from bed, my heart pounding in my chest. They were closer this time, right outside the cabin. I couldn't bring myself to look out the window. I was too scared of what I might see. I just lay there staring at the ceiling, praying for it to stop. Eventually, it did, but I couldn't sleep after that. I kept thinking about those footprints and how close they had been to the door. I felt like I was being watched. I got out of bed and double-checked all the locks on the doors and windows, but it didn't make me feel any safer. Finally, I sat by the fire, trying to forget about everything. But the feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. The next morning, I decided to leave the cabin for a bit, thinking I might feel better if I got out for a while. I drove into town, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. I had lunch, wandered around a few shops, and tried to enjoy the day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like someone was watching me, but every time I turned around, there was no one there. When I returned to the cabin, I saw something that made my blood run cold. More footprints, fresh ones, leading from the woods straight to my bedroom window. They were the same size as the ones I had seen before, deep and clear in the mud. Someone had been standing right outside my window, watching me while I was gone. I panicked. I didn't know what to do. My first thought was to leave, but it was getting dark, and the idea of driving through the woods alone at night scared me just as much. I decided to stay in the cabin but kept all the lights on and made sure every door and window was locked. I grabbed a kitchen knife and kept it close, just in case. I was on high alert, jumping at every little sound. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat on the couch listening and waiting. The footsteps returned, slow, steady, circling the cabin. I could hear them moving, occasionally stopping as if someone was trying to figure out a way in. I gripped the knife tightly, my hands shaking. I didn't know what they wanted or who they were, but I knew I wasn't alone. At some point, the footsteps stopped right outside the back door. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen, but all I heard was silence. Heavy, oppressive silence. Then the doorknob started to turn, slowly, as if someone was testing to see if it was locked. My heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The doorknob rattled for a few more seconds before stopping. I didn't hear anything after that. The footsteps were gone, but I knew they were still out there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting. I stayed up all night, too terrified to move, too scared even to look out the window. I kept imagining those muddy footprints and the person who had left them, standing just outside, waiting for me to make a mistake. When the sun finally came up, I grabbed my things and left the cabin as fast as I could. I didn't care about the rest of the weekend. I just wanted to get out of there. I went for a walk at night, probably around 10:30 p.m., needing to clear my head. You know how it is. Life had been stressing me out, and I just needed to get out of the house. The park near my place is usually quiet at that hour. A few dim streetlights here and there, but mostly just the distant glow from the city. I figured it'd be a good place to think, with no distractions. The cool air and empty paths felt peaceful at first. Just the sound of my footsteps on the sidewalk and the occasional rustling of leaves. I started to feel better, finding my rhythm. There's something about the steady pace of running that helps organize my thoughts. After a while, though, I noticed something strange. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it, but something felt off. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing, so I kept running. But the sense of not being alone clung to me, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I thought I could hear footsteps behind me, but when I stopped to listen, they stopped too. I stood there, catching my breath, listening hard, but all I heard was my own breathing. Shaking it off, I started running again, but that uneasy feeling came back right away, like someone was matching my pace just out of sight. I kept telling myself it was nothing, maybe just my own footsteps echoing, or some stray animal in the bushes, but it didn't feel right. I decided to pick up my pace to shake off the feeling. That's when I heard it, clear as day, footsteps right behind me, keeping perfect time with mine. My heart started pounding. I glanced back but saw nothing, just the empty park behind me. The path was lit by old street lamps, casting long shadows, but no one was there. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was the wind or my own footsteps bouncing off the trees. But then I heard it again, louder this time, like whoever, or whatever, was speeding up. I didn't look back again. I just started running faster. My legs burned, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. I reached the edge of the park, where the path met the main road, and slowed down a bit, thinking I had imagined it all. But when I glanced over my shoulder, I saw a figure in the distance, just at the edge of the light. They stood there, silently watching me. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark shape, but I knew they had been following me. Panic surged through me, and I sprinted toward the road, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear them running behind me, closing the distance fast. Whoever it was, they were quick. I didn't dare look back again, just kept my eyes on the streetlights ahead, praying I'd reach the main road where there might be cars, people, anything to help. The footsteps behind me grew louder, pounding on the pavement. They were right behind me. My legs screamed in pain, and I felt like I was about to collapse, but I pushed on, faster. I could almost feel them reaching out, trying to grab me, and that fear pushed me even harder. Finally, I burst out of the park and onto the main road. Cars were passing by, and the sight was like a lifeline. I stumbled to a stop, chest heaving, looking around wildly for the person who had chased me, but there was no one. The dark park loomed behind me, empty and silent. I stood under the streetlight, shaking, sweat pouring down my face, but the figure was gone. I didn't stick around to see if they'd come back. I ran home as fast as I could, glancing over my shoulder the whole way, half expecting to see that dark shape again. But the streets were empty. When I finally got back to my apartment, my hands were trembling so badly I struggled to unlock the door. I locked it behind me and collapsed on the couch, trying to steady my breathing. My heart was still racing, and I couldn't shake the image of that figure standing there, just watching me from the darkness. I kept hearing those footsteps in my mind, pounding behind me, getting closer and closer. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure, just standing there, watching me from the shadows. I left the lights on and checked the windows every few minutes, making sure no one was out there. I felt like I was losing my mind, like I could have imagined it all, but it had felt so real. The next day, I called in sick to work. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that whoever was in the park could still be out there, watching. I closed all the curtains and stayed inside all day, too scared to leave. Every little noise made me jump, and I couldn't stop thinking about the footsteps that had chased me in the park. I haven't been back there since. I can't even walk past it without that feeling of dread rising in my chest. I keep telling myself it was just some creep messing with me, but it doesn't help. I can't forget how fast they were, how close they got. I've tried running elsewhere, but I can't shake the fear that someone's out there, watching me. I keep glancing over my shoulder, listening for footsteps that aren't there. I was house-sitting for my parents while they were away on vacation. Their home is in a quiet area of Pennsylvania, surrounded by trees and hills. It was supposed to be a peaceful week. The first few days passed without incident. I took care of the mail, watered the plants, and kept the house tidy. One night, as I was about to go to bed, I heard footsteps from upstairs. I paused, thinking it was probably just the old house settling, but the sound continued, slow and deliberate. I went upstairs to check, but there was no one there. I searched all the rooms, including the bathroom, but found nothing unusual. The footsteps seemed to have stopped, so I went back downstairs. I reassured myself it was probably just my imagination or the creaks of an old house. I locked the doors, turned off the lights, and went to bed. The sound didn't return that night, and though I slept fitfully, I managed to get some rest. The next morning, as I was making coffee, I noticed that the attic door was open. I didn't remember seeing it open before. The attic was a place I'd never really explored. My parents had kept it locked for as long as I could remember. It was odd to see it open now. I walked toward the attic door, which was at the end of the hallway. The door was heavy and dusty. I slowly pushed it open, revealing a narrow, steep staircase leading up. The hallway light didn't reach the attic, leaving it completely dark. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and cautiously climbed the stairs. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, the air thick with must and age. At the top, I swept the flashlight around. The attic was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and forgotten belongings. I moved carefully, shining the light over everything. There was nothing unusual, just old items covered in blankets and dust. I saw a rocking chair, some old trunks, and several cardboard boxes stacked in the corner. Nothing seemed out of place. Still feeling uneasy, I went back downstairs and closed the attic door. I checked all the windows and doors to make sure everything was secure. I didn't know why the attic door had been open, but I wanted to be certain it was locked this time. That evening, I felt tense. I kept hearing faint noises, like scratching or movement from above. I convinced myself it was just the house creaking again. I tried to stay calm and get some sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, my thoughts returned to the attic door. Around midnight, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, and it sounded like they were moving around, upstairs. I got up to investigate, but as I reached the top of the stairs, the sound stopped. The upstairs was silent. I checked every room, but everything appeared normal. When I returned to my room, I locked the door. I sat on the bed, trying to calm down. The noises didn't return, and eventually I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I found the attic door open again. It was as if someone had been up there during the night. I went up to check again, but nothing had changed. The attic was just as I'd left it. I shivered as I closed the door once more. I called my parents and told them about the noises and the attic door opening. They were concerned, but reassured me that it was likely just the house making noises. They suggested I check all the locks and make sure everything was secure. I agreed and spent the rest of the day ensuring the house was as secure as possible. That night, I made sure to lock the attic door tightly, even placing a small chair against it for extra security. I went to bed, trying to ignore the growing fear twisting in my gut. The next few nights passed without incident. I didn't hear any more footsteps or strange sounds. It seemed like everything had stopped. My parents returned home, and I was relieved to hand the house back over to them. I never mentioned the noises or the attic door again. They were already worried enough, and I didn't want to add to their stress. I was just happy my time house sitting was over, and I could return to my own place. Looking back, I'm still not sure what happened. Maybe it really was just an old house making strange noises, or maybe someone was trying to scare me. I checked into a hotel outside Baton Rouge. The air was thick with humidity, and I was exhausted after a long day of driving. It was nothing special, just a one-story building with faded light blue paint and a flickering sign. But the price was cheap, which was my main concern at that moment. The woman at the front desk barely looked up when I handed her my card. She handed me the room key and pointed toward the end of the hallway without saying a word. The room was quite small, just a bed, a wall-mounted TV, and a bathroom that smelled faintly of bleach. I dropped my bag on the floor and collapsed onto the bed, too tired to think about finding another place to stay. After a quick shower, I got into bed, scrolling through my phone mindlessly. The room was quiet except for the distant sound of traffic on the highway. I felt uncomfortable, but told myself it was just the unfamiliar surroundings. I had been driving for hours, and my mind was playing tricks on me. Around midnight, I heard the first knock. It wasn't loud, just a soft tapping, like someone gently tapping their fingers against wood. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I hadn't expected anyone, and the hotel had been nearly empty when I checked in. I waited, hoping it was just a mistake, but the knocking continued, this time more insistent. I got out of bed, my feet sinking into the thin carpet, and slowly walked toward the door. I pressed my eye to the peephole but saw only darkness. No one was there. I stood there for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I hesitated, unsure whether to open the door, ultimately convincing myself that there was nothing to worry about, maybe just a few kids playing pranks, and I turned back to bed. But not 5 minutes later, the knocking came again, this time louder, more urgent. I sprang up from the bed, my heart racing. I knew I should ignore it, but something inside me wanted to confront whoever was outside. I threw the blanket off and stepped to the door, flinging it open without looking through the peephole. The hallway was empty, no one in sight. The only sound was the faint buzzing of the overhead light, flickering as if it was about to go out at any moment. I stepped into the hallway, glancing left and right, but saw nothing. The other doors were all shut tight, and the place was eerily quiet. I closed the door and locked it tightly, checking the security chain once more. I tried to go back to bed to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My nerves were on edge, and every little noise startled me. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sign of movement. Just as I was beginning to drift off, the knocking sounded again, this time different, slow, deliberate, as if someone was purposely taunting me. I gritted my teeth, trying to force myself to lie still in bed, but the sound persisted, relentless and infuriating. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped up, grabbed my phone, and rushed to the door, but before I could open it, I noticed something. A small piece of paper had been shoved under the door, barely visible in the dim light. I picked it up, my hands trembling. The paper was old, the edges yellowed as if it had been crumpled and smoothed out again. There was writing on it, scrawled and messy as if the writer had been in a hurry. It was just my name, nothing else, no message, no explanation, just my name. A chill ran down my spine. I looked toward the door, then back at the paper, my mind racing. How did they know my name? I hadn't spoken to anyone except the woman at the front desk, and she didn't seem like the prankster type. I peered through the peephole again, but the hallway remained empty. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to decide what to do. Every instinct told me to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear, my mind spinning with possibilities. Was someone watching me? Had they followed me since I checked in? That thought sent a shiver down my spine. Finally, I forced myself to act. I opened my bag and stuffed my belongings in as quickly as I could, my hands shaking so much I could barely zip it up. I knew I had to get out of there, but the thought of opening the door again made me shudder. As I reached for the doorknob, the knocking began again, this time louder, almost frenzied, as if they were trying to break in. I stumbled back, dropping my bag and running into the bathroom. I locked the door behind me, my heart pounding in my ears. I sat on the edge of the tub, trying to control my breathing. The knocking continued, relentless and terrifying. I stared at the bathroom door, half hoping it would burst open at any moment. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I wasn't safe. Finally, the knocking stopped, and the silence that followed was even worse. I waited, straining to hear any sound, but there was nothing, just the oppressive, suffocating silence. I was in the bathroom for hours, too terrified to move. When I finally gathered the courage to leave, I crept out of the bathroom, my eyes fixed on the door. There was no sound, no sign of anyone outside. The piece of paper with my name still lay on the floor where I had dropped it, a stark reminder of how real everything was. I picked up my bag and rushed to the door. This time, I didn't check the hallway. I just ran, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. I didn't stop until I was in my car, the engine roaring as I drove out of the parking lot. I didn't look back. not wanting to know if anyone was watching me leave. All I could think about was putting as much distance between myself and that motel as possible. I drove for hours, my mind replaying the events of that night over and over. I got off the bus, thinking it was the right stop, twilight settling in as the light faded, quickly realizing I had made a mistake. The bus pulled away, dust rising, leaving me in the middle of nowhere. There was nothing around, just the empty roads stretching out in both directions, no buildings, no streetlights, nothing. I looked at my phone to check the map, but had no signal. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I could walk to the next stop or find a town ahead. It couldn't be that far, could it? But as I started walking, the feeling of dread welled up inside me. The road was too quiet, no cars, no sounds, just my footsteps on the pavement. I kept going, hoping to see some sign of life soon. After a while, I heard a vehicle approaching from behind. I turned around, initially feeling relieved, thinking I could hitch a ride, but as the vehicle got closer, it slowed down. It didn't pass me, it just matched my walking pace. I couldn't see who was driving. The headlights were too bright, blinding me. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe they were just being cautious, but the feeling was all wrong. My instincts were screaming. I quickened my pace, hoping they would get bored and drive away. But the vehicle stayed right behind me. That was when the real fear began. I glanced over my shoulder again, and the vehicle was still there, shadowing me like a ghost. I decided to pick up the pace, my heart pounding in my chest. The vehicle continued to follow, the engine humming as it rolled beside me. I thought about running, but the road was too open, nowhere to hide, just the vast desert stretching out on either side. If I ran, they could easily catch up. I tried to think of another plan, but my mind was racing, unable to focus. Suddenly, the vehicle accelerated and pulled in front of me, blocking my path. The door swung open, and I saw a man step out. He was tall, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He stood there for a moment just staring at me, and I froze. Every instinct told me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. He called to me, his voice too calm, asking if I needed a ride. I shook my head, trying to keep my distance, but he stepped closer. I said I was fine, that I was just going to keep walking, but he didn't seem to care about what I was saying. There was something in his voice that sent chills down my spine. I took a step back, and that was when he lunged at me. I turned and ran as fast as I could. I heard him yell something, but I didn't stop to listen. My legs were burning. My lungs felt like they were on fire, but I kept running without daring to look back. The sound of the engine roared behind me. I knew he was chasing me, tires screeching as he tried to catch up. I veered off the road, stumbling into the desert, hoping the rough terrain would slow him down. The ground was uneven, rocks and bushes tripping me up, but I didn't stop. I could hear the vehicle crashing through the brush, the headlights slicing through the night, getting closer. I saw a small hill ahead and ran toward it. My only thought was to get out of sight. I climbed over the rocks, my hands scraping against the sharp edges, but I didn't care. I just needed to hide. I dropped down on the other side, praying he wouldn't find me. I lay there, listening to the engine roar as it circled around, my heart racing, barely breathing. After what felt like hours, the sound finally faded into the distance. I lay there in the dark, trembling, terrified to move. I didn't know if he was gone for good or just waiting. I stayed there until the sun began to rise, the first light of dawn breaking the horizon, and only then did I dare to peek out. The road was empty, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I climbed back to the top of the hill, trying to figure out where I was. I could see the road stretching out before me, the early morning light painting the landscape in soft colors. There was still no sign of the vehicle, and I knew I had to get to safety. As I picked my way down the hill, I heard something behind me, a faint sound, almost like the whisper of wind, but it was different, more sinister. I turned around and froze. Standing at the top of the hill was the man, the same baseball cap shading his face, just watching me. A cold dread seeped into my bones. My feet wouldn't move, and I felt paralyzed, like a deer caught in headlights. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest, and he stepped forward, a twisted grin breaking across his face. I turned and ran again, but this time I didn't look back. One night I was working late at the office. It was just 9 p.m., and the building was nearly empty. I was finishing up a report that was due the next day, and the office was eerily silent, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional rustle of paper. Finally, when I completed my work, I decided it was time to go home. I packed my things and headed to the elevator. I pressed the button and waited. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, and I stepped in, relieved to be heading home. Just as the doors were about to close, another man hurriedly stepped inside. I glanced at him and noticed he seemed disheveled, as if he had just run or something, with wrinkled and slightly dirty clothes, and his eyes appeared wild. I tried to ignore him and focused on the numbers lighting up as the elevator started moving. Suddenly, the elevator jolted and the lights flickered out. I felt a wave of panic as the light completely disappeared for a few seconds. When the lights came back on, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The man's hands were stained with what looked like blood. Not just a small amount, but a lot. My mind raced. I wanted to say something, to ask if he was okay, but I couldn't find the words. I just stood there, trying to keep calm. The man seemed to sense my unease. He looked at me with wide, unblinking eyes, and I could see fear in his expression, as if he were trapped in his own world, unable to focus on anything else. The elevator stopped again, and the lights flickered once more. I could hear the soft buzzing of the emergency light above. The man took a deep breath, and I noticed his hands were trembling. He glanced around the elevator and then looked at me as if trying to comprehend something. "Is something wrong?" I finally managed to ask, trying to keep my voice steady. My throat felt dry, and my heart raced in my chest. He didn't respond right away, just stared at me, and I could see his eyes darting around, as if he were trying to remember something. The silence in the elevator was deafening. I wanted to hit the emergency button, but my hands felt heavy. After what felt like an eternity, he said, "They're coming." His voice was shaky. "They'll find me." I didn't understand what he meant. "Who's coming?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I could see the fear in his eyes, and it only made me more anxious. He didn't answer, but began pacing the small space, his bloodied hands flailing noisily. Occasionally, he would stop and stare at the elevator doors as if waiting for them to open at any moment. I tried to stand as far away from him as possible, my mind racing to come up with a plan. The thought of what he might have done or who might be after him made me shiver. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I needed to stay calm and avoid provoking him. The elevator jolted again, and the lights flickered even more this time. I heard a faint noise from somewhere above, and the elevator stopped. My heart raced, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I tried to press the emergency button, but it seemed to be unresponsive. The man's breathing became heavier, more erratic. He appeared to be experiencing some sort of crisis. I could see his gaze darting around the elevator, and he was mumbling to himself. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but his tone was desperate and frantic. I knew I needed to get out of there, but the elevator wasn't moving. I looked around, trying to find something that could help, but the emergency phone in the elevator was broken. I felt completely trapped. The thought of being stuck there with someone who could be dangerous was terrifying. Suddenly, the man stopped and turned to me, his eyes wide, as if he was about to say something. But then he just leaned against the wall and slid down to the floor, his back resting against the elevator wall. His breathing was heavy, and he seemed exhausted. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I waited what felt like a century before hearing the faint sounds of rescuers talking outside the elevator shaft. I could only hear bits and pieces, but the sound brought me a glimmer of hope. Finally, the elevator doors began to open slowly, lights spilling in from the hallway, and I saw a group of rescuers at the door. They looked at the man sitting on the floor, then glanced at me, and I could see the concern in their eyes. One of the rescuers stepped inside to check on the man, while another helped me out of the elevator. They asked me questions, but I was too panicked to answer properly. I just pointed at the man and said he needed help. They took charge of the situation, carefully assessing it. The man remained sitting on the floor, his hands still covered in blood. I couldn't tell if he was dangerous or not. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as I was led out of the building. Later, I learned that the man had been arrested and taken to the hospital. It turned out he had been involved in a violent incident, and the blood on his hands was from that. The police handled everything from there. Occasionally, I still think about that night, the feeling of being trapped in the elevator with an unstable person, not knowing what would happen next. It's something I can't forget.